You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Hey, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. And we are putting up some really exciting podcasts this month. First of all, I want to just say to folks, to our podcast family, thank you for the crazy downloads of the genealogy series. We broke records last month. We had more downloads in January than we've ever had. And we had 4 times the regular weekly downloads just last week. And so if you're listening and you're thinking, wait a minute, you know, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't hear your genealogy series. Well, that probably means a few things. One, that you have not subscribed. And so, hey, stop bootlegging. Subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. That way, we'll deliver it right to your inbox. You can also go to alexg.com. You can subscribe there, where you'll get a weekly notice of updates on either new podcasts that I put out or blogs that I've written. And just another shout out to our listeners in Seattle. You've really shown up the other cities, and we've got some challenges going on out there. So I've talked to people from other communities who are thinking that they want to overtake Seattle and San Francisco, the Bay Area, for being our largest listening, or some of our largest listening audiences. So if you're from the East Coast, you got some work to do. So listen, tell your friends, subscribe, and that's how you move up in the ranks as our listening audience. I'm trying to find out the communities that are really and consistently just downloading in a big way, because I want to come to your community and do a show or a gathering or something. So right now, Oakland's on my schedule. Well, it's about to become on my schedule. But if you want me to come to your community, you've got to start doing your work. Listen, we're doing something really special for February. For African Americans, we know what February means. It's Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, 4th of July, everything rolled up in once. You know, any black speaker worth their salt, you're tired by this time of the year because you're speaking, you're explaining, you're going to soul food dinners, you're telling people about all kinds of stuff. But the upside of it is people are really trying to understand what it means to be African American, what's the importance of African American culture in our community. And so a lot of it's going on. But what I wanted to do is to talk to friends and colleagues, particularly those who are not black, to ask what African American History Month means to them, Black History Month means to them, things that they do to celebrate it, or things that they're doing to really understand the importance of the contributions of African Americans. In the studio today, I have 2 professors with whom I've worked in the community to offer U.S. Black History courses through my program, Justified Anger. They are Professor Stephen Kantrowitz and Professor Alexander Shasko. Steve Kantrowitz studied at Princeton. He is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History, and he's an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Afro-American Studies and the American Indian Studies program. He really focuses on Reconstruction and on white supremacy, and he teaches a lot about slave revolts. Alexander Shasko, a Wisconsin native. He teaches in the Department of Afro-American Studies as well. He teaches contemporary African-American political and cultural history. I wanted to do something special by having white men who teach Black history appear on the show and talk about why and how and the response to their teaching methods. I met these 2 gentlemen because my nonprofit organization, Nehemiah, has an impetus called Justified Anger, where we're really talking about building bridges so that we can eradicate racial disparities. And one of the things that we do that I'm really proud of is we host a 9-week U.S. Black History course. And both of these gentlemen are instructors for that program. We just kicked off recently. We've got about 8 more weeks to go. But I just want to say, and just to say to both of these gentlemen, welcome to Black Like Me, and I'm really glad you're here.
Thanks. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Sure. Okay, listen, you all. One of the things that I do is I usually ask my African-American guests questions that are called Black Icebreakers. And then we do something else for non-African Americans. But since you teach in this area, I want to ask you the questions that I would ask some of the Black folks. And don't worry, you don't get kicked off if you get anything. You don't get anything wrong. But so let me. And whoever has the answer can just jump in. Who was the first Black person ever in America?
Oh, first Black person ever. First Black person ever in America.
Don't even answer that. I just did that just to throw you off. That's what's so funny about having academics. They're like,
Actually,
the first one
they're gonna come up with the name.
I mean, the first person I teach
Snap.
about is John Punch, who
I think that's right.
was one of the three.
I love it. I love
was
it.
one of the three indentured servants who tried to escape. And that was a really key moment, actually, in the history of slavery, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I
No,
should
no,
do that
no,
to you.
no, keep going.
Because basically they were all these three indentured servants, two of whom were white, one of whom was African American, were captured after they tried to escape, and the two white indentured servants were given one additional year of indentured servitude, and John Punch was put into slavery.
Right.
Okay, we're going to put a link up to that. So I just found the first black person.
Yeah.
And when would that have been, around 1619, about 400
I think
years ago?
Well, it was 1619 when they came. 1640 is when that happened. So that's why he's not technically the first, probably. But
right, exactly.
the first name that comes up.
But that
to
is the
mind.
first name that comes up.
Yeah.
The thing I should say about that is that the categories black and white or African American and white didn't even exist at that point.
Also
They
true.
were those events were the events that were creating those categories.
Exactly right.
Got you.
Yeah.
So note to self, if you're ever going to ask black ice-breaking questions to white men, make sure that they're not academics.
That might come in handy.
It might come in handy. Snap. Oh man, that's good. That's really good. I love that. Hey, I've got a couple of other questions I put together for you gentlemen. Grits or cream of wheat growing up?
I mean, I can't front. I mean, cream of wheat.
Neither. I'm from Boston.
So you had baked beans.
Oatmeal.
Oatmeal. That's right. Oatmeal. Okay,
Yeah.
got you. Did you put butter and sugar on your oatmeal?
Later on. Brown
Later
sugar.
on.
Yeah.
Brown sugar, yeah.
Oh man. Okay. So another question I ask folks: do you prefer collards or turnips with greens?
Collards, hands down.
Yeah, me too.
I knew I liked you guys for something. I have this. I put a post up on Facebook that like growing up, there's the collards camp, and then the folks who mix the turnips and the mustards. Now there's this new brand that puts all three together and have different. So, and I put a picture up just to laugh at. I'm like, come on, this is an ice cream. You can't Neapolitanize ice cream. But yeah, they got like it's called Country Greens. It's just got mustards, collards, and turnip.
That's a great image, the Neapolitan.
Yeah,
green
the
stuff.
greens.
Well, you know, and when I said that, I thought, okay, do people like when I grew up? We always said, because my mom liked vanilla, I like strawberry, my sister liked chocolate. And I don't even know if Lexi knows, my daughter knows what Neapolitan ice cream is.
I think we're all dating ourselves.
Yeah, we should. Okay, that's
Maybe.
right. That's right. Let's see. Fact or fiction for you? Did you have to be on the front porch by the time the streetlights came on while you were a kid playing outside?
No front porch.
Oh, did you have to be in the house by the time?
Backyard.
Yeah, usually. Yeah, usually I had to be back by then. It kind of depended. I mean, sometimes I was down at. I mean, it was only a couple blocks to the school playground. I mean, my parents could practically see it.
Yeah, yes.
So the lights were on over there, and it was summer. I could stay a little longer.
And Steve, I heard you lecture, so we know this kind of goes back, at least in African American culture, with just this whole idea of what's it called, sundown
Yeah.
communities.
Sundown
Absolutely.
towns, sure.
And but so many kids in my community who were raised around their grandparents, just hey, when the sun hits the treetops, when the street light's on, that's like the warning light. That's like when it's flashing. But when you start seeing it setting, but it just has these roots about just being safe. Parents want to know where you were, want to make sure that people weren't weren't doing anything to you because you're black black teen. Do you remember what day of the week Soul Train came on?
It was Saturday morning.
That's right, because you teach African
teach the
American music. That's
music.
right.
Yeah.
Saturday morning.
Saturday morning.
I haven't watched the show that's out right now on BET. They just.
I want to
started.
capture that. Yeah,
Someone
just
told
came
me
out.
it was pretty good.
That
Yeah,
looked
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is really.
I watched it all the time.
Hey, did in your homes growing up, was there a can of like Crisco, like used Crisco grease that was sitting on the stove that your relatives used for cooking?
There was not.
No.
There is in my current house.
Man, I don't see that much anymore. But yeah, I remember that blue can growing up. Let's see. What's the longest period of time you've ever waited in the barbershop for a haircut?
Longest time I've ever waited in the barbershop. I would say about a half hour, maybe.
half hour, 45 minutes, but it's been a while.
It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Kids and it's not a community experience for me
No,
anymore.
I think it's like 4 days for me. You go there, you have new growth just waiting for them.
waiting.
Well, fortunately, there's this new movement in a lot of the black barbershops where it's appointment only. Like I can text and set up my appointment. But as a kid, I'd go in at like 8 o'clock. And there'd be like 3 barbers, and you cross your fingers and hope that you got the one you wanted, like the one who could see. And you literally sit there for 3 to 4 hours. And if you're waiting for your little brother, or you missed the whole morning, cartoons and everything.
That barbershop still exists, actually, or now exists in my neighborhood on Atwood.
The appointment only, or the one that you?
No.
I've heard of it. There's a lion out the door.
Young men like lined up inside. Sometimes some moms. 3 barbers.
Oh,
yep.
Yes. Tyler, I think you told me about that.
Yeah.
No, that's. Man, let me see if I got any other. What do you think Al Green's favorite breakfast cereal is? Maybe I should say least favorite. What do you think is least favorite breakfast?
Well, I was going to go with favorite. I was going to go with Sugar Smacks for that.
Ooh, that's a good answer.
That's a good answer.
That's a very
Were
good
you going to say something,
answer.
Steve?
Yeah.
No, I can't do better than that. That's very good.
Well, there was this thing that was out when I was a kid that he got into a fight with his wife or girlfriend or something, and she threw some hot grits on him.
She did.
That is true. So maybe I should say what's his least favorite?
Yeah.
What's something that's cold? His favorite is cold.
He should have gone with the cream of wheat.
He should have.
Totally.
No, that would hurt too, wouldn't it?
Much less sticky, though.
Oh man. Well, okay, gentlemen, thank you for playing. I love that. That's just a way of ice breaking.
That's the closest we'll get to Black Jeopardy, too.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's true.
Well, let me just let our listeners know that Steve and I were on a panel years ago at our Central Library, and basically we were asking to lead some discussion on a film about Black life, and I pulled Steve to the side afterwards and I said, I've got this idea. I think that we can help white allies really become allies if they understand U.S. Black history. I think we're trying to fix things from where we are and don't know how we got here. So the assumption is those black fathers, if people just go to school, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And so I think, Steve, we processed for maybe 8 months, if not a year. We had several breakfasts and lunch meetings to really design what's known as this U.S. Black history course.
Yep.
We kicked this off in 2016. We had 150 students. Next year, we jumped up and we opened the class up to 250. We just registered our 900th participant. We had 270, 280 people show up on Monday. We have to park them down at Comstock and Park Bank and bus them up or give them a ride up the hill. But it's amazing. And there's 100 people on the waiting list. So in addition to the 280 who are there, 100 people are on the waiting list.
Fantastic.
And so it's just really tremendous. And so I'm really honored to have you on the show, Steve, because we've developed a friendship. I mean, we met Christmas Eve one day. Remember we had a breakfast over on at lunch or something like that, just trying to get the curriculum ready.
Yep.
For the next year, and then you took off to Europe for work. You and your family, you're just doing some research over there, and just you were there just on doing some study. And then you gave me the names of colleagues who you thought would really be good. So you mentioned Christy Clark-Pujara and Alexander Shasko, and they came in and just really hit it out the park. And what's been really great is that when you returned back to the U.S., we were able to incorporate you all and not just say, okay, well, hell, Steve's back. So thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Christy. And so you all last year was just an all-star team, as well as Dr. Neil Kadesh. You did a great job this week as well.
Fantastic.
And so let me just start off with a couple of things. So I'm grateful, but I'm also intrigued when white men are studying and teaching African-American history. And so I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure people just ask you always, why? To each of you, why are you passionate about this area of study, and what do you think triggered the interest in this discipline? And this is really meant to be casual, so just jump in.
Well, I could give you an intellectual answer, I could give you a political answer, but the real answer is very personal, and it's about where and when I grew up. So I grew up in a liberal, secular Jewish family in a predominantly Jewish suburb of Boston, Brookline, Massachusetts, which is basically an urban town surrounded by Boston on 3 sides. And I was born in 1965. So I was 8 years old or 9 years old when the school year in 1974 began in Boston, which was the struggle over the desegregation of the Boston public schools.
Oh, right,
under court
right.
order, busing, as it's known
Sure.
colloquially. And that was right on top of the last days of the Vietnam War, at least the Vietnam conflict
Sure.
as the U.S. understands it. And I remember sitting in, this is before the internet and before streaming news, and sitting in the car with my father and him refusing to get out of the car because it was the top of the hour and the radio news was playing. And the two datelines that happen over and over again in my memory of this are Phnom Penh and Boston. And both were places of terrible and inexplicable conflict. And one of them was literally halfway around the world, and the other was literally 2 miles away from where I was. But from where I sat, they were equally far away. I lived in this calm, protected, suburban world that by some accident of history, or as I later learned, some pretty clear intentional histories, had been fully insulated and isolated from the dramatic social conflicts of the moment.
Sure.
And that those social conflicts had everything to do with the history of racism in the United States.
Wow. It was right at your front door, basically.
It was at my front door, and it made no sense to me that I was so insulated from it, and yet it was so close. You could hear Fenway Park from my parents' house, and you could hear the conflicts over the busing from Fenway Park. It's
Wow. Yes.
yeah. So that remained a kind of inexplicable feature of my life for much of my life. And by the time I was 14 or 15, and a high school teacher, a white high school teacher, put the souls of black folk in our hands.
Okay.
That latent bomb was the fuse was lit on it, and by the time I was 18 or 19, I couldn't stop thinking about this history, and by the time I was 20, I knew I had to study it.
I love the way history and experiences in our lives really set the course for what we want to study and what we want to do and become. That's powerful. Alexander, how about you?
Mine starts with a transistor radio, listening to the Spinners under my pillow
love the
late at night
Spinners.
Me too.
after I'm supposed to be in bed.
What's your favorite Spinner song?
Oh man, I mean, "I'll Be Around" is pretty hard to top.
Yeah.
The cover there, really, just a
You
great.
can fall in love with that song.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, but please continue.
No, it's a great. I mean, I could go on the whole time. I won't even start with my frustration that they're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is
I've seen you
scandalous.
write about that.
But it was listening to the Spinners, and it was listening to soul music and R&B and disco.
Here in Wisconsin, you grew up in Wisconsin.
I grew up in Shorewood, which is a
Okay.
suburb of Milwaukee,
Sure.
so not the Shorewood here in Madison. Just listening to that music, and kind of listening to music in three different ways. That was the music I was just kind of listening to when I was really young, and hip hop started, and I was listening to that from a young age. And then my mom in particular just had a lot of old R&B and rock and roll records all the way back to the 50s, and so I would be listening to a lot of those, and I sort of in a way grew up weirdly listening to the history of rock and roll and R&B in chronological order, even though I'm not of age for that, but I did, which comes in handy teaching it, I suppose.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so I think it was really the music where I started with that, but I think it's two other things too, and this gets to about personal experience as well. One is that I am also the child of historians. My father taught Russian and East European history for 43 years at UW Milwaukee, and my mom's is a high school history teacher, retired, and taught American history. So I think that those were always subjects that were deeply ingrained into my life experience, and I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in that way.
Right.
But the other thing is that my parents are both immigrants, and I'm from an immigrant family, and it's also a cliche, but it's one that is sometimes true, that often children of immigrants are deeply invested in trying to understand America and trying to understand the place that they are.
Yeah.
That the rest of your family is also invested in that, but in a different kind of way, right? Trying to keep connected to the life experience that they had and the places they came from honorably, right? But at the same time, trying to figure out where they are. And when you're the children of immigrants in that way, it's often you're often in a place where you're just trying to get the lay of the land when things that people who have lived here take for granted are new to you.
Right.
You are both curious about it and often can see it in slightly different ways. And so I think that those are the three elements that really combined to really draw my interest into American history, and that's sort of what set me in that direction.
I love it. Who was more surprised by your choice of this area of study? Folks who look like you or folks who look like me?
Folks who look like you.
Okay, tell me more about that, Steve.
First,
like, why are you studying our history?
Honestly, the first reaction when I was coming up as a graduate student, and I was not identifying myself as studying Black history. I was actually working in history of white supremacy.
All right.
A closely related field, but not the same field.
You're right.
Not quite the same.
And very often when I described to African Americans who I just met what I was doing, I would get a skeptical or cautious response. And then occasionally, I remember at a wedding, tell the truth.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which I felt like I was going to do, but people want to know what your investments are, that this is not simply a professional matter or an intellectual matter or something that you put down at the end of the day. I mean, I think occasionally my daughter has wished that I would put it down at the end of the day, but not anymore. Probably she's now 10, and I think she gets it now.
Sure.
For a while, coming home and talking about the hard stuff in American history, and my wife is a historian whose first book was on the transatlantic slave trade, so we would.
You guys must
be
have
home.
Exciting discussions around the dinner table. I need to come over for dinner.
My daughter would say, history makes me sad. History is all sad stuff. And then we realized that we needed to do a little work with that, how we were talking about it and what we were talking about. But yeah, the there's a degree of, I think, justified skepticism about what white people are doing when they invest themselves in this history. And I feel like that's legitimate, but I should be able to answer that question. It's on me to answer that question.
Sure.
I feel like I can answer it pretty well now, with a little shorter answer than the one I gave you a minute ago.
No, that's. Yeah. I remember entering the department in the early '80s. I was an econ major, and I took all of my breadth and depth courses out of Afro-Am, and didn't know that I got enough credit, had taken enough credits to get a major. And I loved it. I mean, this is back like when Professor Nellie McKay was teaching. Yeah, so it was. But when I went to see my advisor, Bill Vanderburg was the chair of the department and my advisor. So when I walked in, the last thing I expected as a young African American, what was I, 17, 18, that my advisor was a white man,
right?
Talking to me about African American history and studies and advised me on my major. It took me a while to warm up to it. I would go back to my other friends and say, "Do you know what? My advisor is white, and African Americans, like, they can't find Black people. Like, what's going on?" We became friends. He was my mom's advisor, my sister's advisor, became a friend of the family. But as a student, that was a bit jarring, walking in and meeting Bill Vanderburg.
Sure.
Well, and I think that it's too much to call it skepticism, but perhaps the sort of disruptive nature of that is understandable. I mean, I think that one of the roles of an African American studies program or department is, at least in part, to promote diversity in a lot of different ways, right? And to create role models and all of those other kinds of things, and that should be part of it, but not the whole thing, right? And so when you're in that space and you come as a student, you may very well be expecting to get one thing out of it, and you end up getting something else. Instead.
Oh, definitely.
That absolutely can happen. I get a lot of students who come in and other people who come and talk to me, and I get this very vague question, which is sort of, how did you end up, doing what you do?
Right.
They don't, like, there's a lot of reluctance to even ask the question in a direct way, which is understandable because it's sensitive and it can be personal for people and all of that. So I get that. So then I have to kind of explain how that all came to pass and how it really came to pass for me more through the music than through my formal training. But I want to say that with an asterisk because like Steve, my formal training was not in African American history in graduate school. However, there's no training in history in graduate school now that doesn't involve African American history in some way or another. I mean, there are ways to minimize it if it's something you choose to do, or if your focus is on some other field. You might not get a lot of it.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the big changes in the study of American history over time has been that the centrality of the African American experience is so embedded now into the historiography that it almost, well, let's put it this way, what a handful of people could have done in terms of teaching this material 50 years ago, any graduate student could do
That's
today.
correct.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I've been in this department at UW in the history department for almost 25 years.
Wow.
And for the first 10 of those years, it was quite possible to bring a candidate for a job on campus in 20th century U.S. history who had no familiarity or competence in African American history. And we were behind the times in that way.
Sure.
And some of us aggressively resisted that, the willingness to tolerate that. But we understood that we were behind the times. And now it just doesn't happen. It's not that everybody works in Black history. It's just that everybody has been trained in some aspects of it that are relevant to what they're studying,
right?
Whether or not it's at the center.
Sure.
That's. I mean, if you do environmental history now, you learn about the relationship between social justice issues and the environment.
That's amazing. I didn't realize that. That's
that
good
is something
to know.
that has changed over time in a dramatic way. That's just one example of sort of how these things work.
And it's something that's changed because departments of history insisted on it. The profession collectively insisted on it, generally spurred by Black faculty and allied white faculty. Generally speaking, and it's not automatic. It's not just we continue to make progress, because you can look at where, for example, Native American history is in the curriculum, and it is 15, 20 years behind where Black history is in terms of its integration and the understanding that it's essential.
So we have
to
more
the
work
history.
to do.
We
in
have
that
a lot of
area.
work to do. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions that people knew I was going to be interviewing you, so people actually gave me questions, some things to ask you all. But let me ask this first of all, Stephen. In your area of study, is there a period of time that I'm just trying to figure out like what era period of time you focus on, because then my next question is going to be, what are some of the parallels you've noticed from that era to now?
Yeah.
So like you studied, talked about white supremacy and other things. So is there?
So for me, it's Reconstruction with decades before and decades after as the span that I'm really interested in.
And Alexander, how about you?
For me, it's post 1945, post World War II history to the present. So it's pretty connected to present day as it is.
So then, Steve, we'll go back a little further. So I'll ask you. So I'm sure people want to know, when they find out what you're doing, are we making strides? Are we getting better as a nation? And I know there are net gains. We'll take a step forward and some back. But I guess I'm really interested in are there major themes or thought processes that were very prevalent during that period, prior to Reconstruction and after the turn of the century, that you see either resurfacing now or not really changing?
Well, the thing that's so hard to convey to anyone, it's been hard for me to learn it, honestly, about Reconstruction. It's a very complicated period. It's a very multifaceted era, but it's a revolution.
Yes.
It's a social, economic, legal, constitutional, political revolution in American history. We come out of it, among other things, absolutely without legal chattel slavery, without...
I'm sorry, tell people the years, because a lot of our listeners...
So Reconstruction is,
won't know.
Generally speaking, the decade or dozen years after the Civil War.
Right.
So it's conventionally dated 1865 to 1877, or sometimes 1863 to 1877. And in that period, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which creates universal, equal national citizenship, due process, equal protection,
Right.
and the 15th Amendment, which prohibits denying the vote to people on the basis of race. Those are really transformative actions, and they're backed up by laws and policies of Congress that actually enforce them on the ground in the South and sometimes elsewhere.
100 years before the Voter Registration Act of the 1960s.
Exactly. It's hard to convey what a revolution that is, because up until 1865, slavery was woven into the fabric of the Constitution. Equality was not. After 1870, equality is woven into the fabric of the Constitution, and slavery is not.
Right.
And so it's a new Constitution. It's a new social order in the South. It's a new national order of race, politics, and citizenship. It is truly a revolution. And then it gets overthrown.
Right.
And so it's hard for people who have a progressive understanding of U.S. history. That is, we have ups and downs, but basically things are getting more equal, more free, better all the time. It's hard for people to understand that if you were standing in a variety of locations in 1869 or 1871 or even 1875, you could think we're on the cusp of a new era. And lots of people did feel that way. We are really on the brink of creating a non-racial republic. If you've been standing in any of those same places in 1900, you would not have had that thought, because those gains had substantially been reversed, sometimes very violently.
Yes.
Certainly with the connivance of politicians, of the Supreme Court, and of your fellow countrymen of all kinds and descriptions.
Right.
So understanding the way that that's a revolution and the way that revolution was overthrown, I think most Americans don't have an understanding of that goes to the bone. I know that it took me many years, even as a PhD teaching American history, to really fully grasp that.
I'd never heard the term Reconstruction until I was a college student at UW-Madison in the Afro-Am department. We didn't talk about it around the dinner table. It never came up in our history classes. And I thought, no, black people could not have been elected to public office in the South during Reconstruction. I would have heard of that.
About 1,000.
That could not have happened, and it happened.
Yeah.
Well, and part of the reason why you didn't know is because of the structure of how high school history courses were taught.
Right.
It would be
That's
U.S.
true.
history to the Civil War, and then it would be U.S. history since the Civil War, and, well, what's that space right in between?
Right.
Theoretically, someone should get to it.
Right.
Realistically,
So what's that about?
A lot of teachers didn't get to it. Well,
Your
that's
mom's
a
a
great
high school
question.
history teacher. So
Great
what's that
question.
about? Just leaving out that period that Steve's talking about. I mean, when you don't look at American history and don't teach it from the Civil War or the War of the State, even from Civil War to, you leave out a lot of things that have shaped this country and its policies and its politics. And
You mean if you just teach one or the other?
right.
Well, I think it's just the nature of it being sort of separate semesters.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this is a teaching and like a sort of coordination question. Which side is going to teach this part of it? I mean, we talked about this last semester when we taught for you. Who's going to do Jim Crow segregation?
Right.
Are you going to do it?
Right.
Is it going to be post-Reconstruction?
Right.
Or is it pre-World War II? It's
Right.
both is the answer, of
Right.
course, right? But but it also that is also a period that sometimes falls into this in-between space because there are so many huge events
Totally.
going on in history at the same time. You have the Depression and both World Wars and all these other things that are going on. In fact, Henry Louis Gates has a book coming out in a month that is basically the period from Reconstruction through the end of the 1920s.
And a documentary.
Yeah, and a documentary that goes with it.
We've been needing that because
Yeah.
just growing up as a black kid in this community, all I knew about history was the slave trade, because the chapter opened up with an African man with a chain or
the diagram of the slave ship. Brooks.
exactly all of that. So it was horrifying while your friends giggle about it.
Yeah.
But we never talked about Reconstruction. We never talked about the period of time where black denominations, black sororities and fraternities, service organizations were created. We never talked about Freemasonry. I know that's
Right.
an area of passion for you, Steve. And so to have missed all of that, and so it sort of gave us a picture that there are maybe 7 or 8 bad slaveholders, but the rest of white America fought to free slaves.
Yep.
We should be grateful. We should be thankful, and we just haven't caught up yet because of a number of social, political issues that are of our own making. and the dots were never really connected. So when you go through that process, it kicks you in the gut. It makes you feel, I've only been beneath and not above. I've only been taken care of. That does something to a black kid's psyche, because we're talking about the otherwise very good and powerful school system. Yeah. But I can remember my mom saying in second grade, coming home, she said the lights went out in my eyes, and she just said, I asked, Mom, were we really slaves? Yeah. And I remember being in first grade in Chicago with a black class and a black teacher saying, I want to be the president of the United States. And Mrs. Turner said, Alexander, back in those days, she called me Alexander. Alexander's going to be the president of the United States, and wrote it on the board to affirm it in front of the whole class. I moved to Madison, and I'm told I was a slave, and I never again said I wanted to be president of the United States. Never again said that.
You know, when I first got here, I was expected to teach either the first half or the second half of the U.S. survey, and that conventionally breaks around Reconstruction.
Sure.
And I just refused, and they thought I was being a prima donna. And I said, no, I actually think you can't break up the survey that way and teach the history I want to teach. So I developed this class in 19th century America, which I taught for a long time. I will say that, and that puts emancipation and Reconstruction at the center of the story. Make sure you get time to dwell on it, to linger with what came before and what came after. I will tell you, though, that the problem with that course as I taught it for a long time is that it ended in the Jim Crow era. And that's a terrible place to end a course.
Well, yes.
And I was describing the course to my late colleague Gerda Lerner, who was a pioneer in women's history. Yeah, really, really important thinker and writer. And she just shook her head at me with all of her, emigre, radical, snick, sensibility, and said, you can't end there. She was from Austria. You can't end there. You have to end in the progressive area. They have to have hope.
Right.
I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. So we're always learning. But
and it's always a challenge. I mean, we won't go too far down this road, but it's always a challenge as a teacher to figure out where you start and where you end, because there are always consequences. Just to kind of overlap with what we were talking about, I teach a class on the history of race relations from the New Deal to the New Right, so starting in the 1930s. But that is not where I start. I start in 1619 for a day, and then I start in earnest in Reconstruction, because they don't know it. And what in the world does the civil rights movement mean if you don't understand what Jim Crow segregation is and how it happened?
Or what the civil rights movement could leverage in terms of Reconstruction.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing I would add about this and about this story of Reconstruction is just that part of the way Reconstruction ended, Steve can speak to this much better than I can, was a kind of erasure of this question of the fate of the freed slaves of these newly freed African Americans, that it was about sublimating that question in order to unify the white North and the white South. And I would think that I don't think it's too much to say that the erasure in the teaching over the course of generations is connected in some way to that.
Totally connected to that, and very explicitly so. There's an article in the Atlantic magazine in 1900 by Professor Woodrow Wilson of Princeton University, who would be president 12 years later, about Reconstruction. And in that article, he says, Black history plays a very, very small role in his discussion. It's a struggle between white Northerners and white Southerners, ex-Union and ex-Confederate white people. But he says, and when in the 1870s, the whites who were the real citizens regained control, Black Southerners paid a terrible price for their having played a part in this experiment. Wow. Yeah, and that was really a more or less elite consensual view of American history by the turn of the century, and it was really only people who thought of themselves, understood themselves to be, and were called radicals, who in the 1930s. W.B. Du Bois, some white communists, like a guy who went by the name James Allen when he wrote, a few others, who really articulated an alternative view. And then a few iconoclastic white Southerners who didn't really buy the conventional wisdom. Sure. It wasn't until the 1950s that even began to penetrate the scholarly consensus.
Do you think that white students in your classes are disarmed a bit as you talk about specifically about African American history? I'm just wondering if people assume that maybe there's an agenda. If an African American person is teaching about Reconstruction or civil rights or the areas you're talking about, do you think you've been able to help a light come on for non-black students, but specifically white students in your classes?
I'm certain that is the case, because I have had students come to my office almost every semester I have taught in tears,
saying, "Why didn't I learn this?"
Saying that this is stuff I didn't know, or I didn't understand it this way, or it's something that I've never experienced, or even something as simple as, I haven't really had a class where I've had time to really think about the world and my place in it, because I'm so fixated on getting a job and doing the kind of class coursework that is about getting a job later. But more profoundly than that, it's often about the material itself.
And what do you say to them?
Well, I'm humbled by it, first of all, every single time.
Sure.
I tell them to think hard about it. I tell them to not forget this experience. I tell them to make sure to kind of integrate it into their life as they move forward and they go on, because I think ultimately that's what we're trying to do, is to try to to me, what I do, especially because the history I teach is so contemporary, is to give people a kind of framework to understand the world in a more rigorous and complex way. That's what I see my role as. I sometimes tell my students flat out that I'm teaching a citizenship class. This is not indoctrination, but it's citizenship. It's like understanding something about your role in society and what society is about. And I do think it affects students. And you asked earlier about this question about what it means to be a white person teaching this material. There's no way to universalize the relationship that we have with individual students. I mean, I teach 500 students a semester. That's its own question. Like, what does that mean to teach people in the abstract, which is kind of what I'm doing. But I'm sure for some of the white students, seeing me up there is powerful, talking about this material.
Definitely.
That here is someone who chose to teach this. Here is someone who comes from my background, potentially.
And he's not an angry black person.
Right. But,
You're angry, but not angry black. I've talked to you enough. I know you got a little anger in there.
And so that can affect people too. Like, that here's an opening. And for some of the African-American students, here is someone who actually is connected to this and does take it seriously, and that can provide some inspiration or hope in its own way too.
And you can say things that they as students don't have to say to their classmates. When Steve and I first met years ago, we had a little debate as to whether or not the first teaching team should be a black and white person. I said, Steve, I want to disarm the white participants. This is really a class for white people, but I want them to not have the barrier of thinking, okay, what's his angle? Is this propaganda? I want them fully I just want to fly beneath the radar and just have you come in and lecture. And there was some little partnership going on in probably the first lectures, but I felt like what you just described, Alexander, is what I wanted to happen. And I felt that what really got the course on the trajectory that it is now, that Steve could say things without apology and without it being cloudy, that I think if someone else had said right off the bat, it would have been difficult to hear.
I say that I use the phrase white supremacy. And it sounds like an analytical category.
That's right.
Or a historical description, not an attack.
Right. If I say it. But you're right. It was her. But I still felt sort of when you said it, but people still leaned in to say, let's see why he's saying this. It still was a little safer. Not saying that your material was not powerful. It was. It's what set up this, what's now, our fourth year in doing it. But I felt that people were able to really lean into the information more.
Well, I think, too, when thinking here specifically about white teacher, white students, Black history, there's a way in which a white teacher can model carefully his or her own discomfort, his or her own foibles, his or her own process of coming to grips with the history and with the process itself. Mm-hmm. And I do that in the Justified Anger class. I do that in my own class. In my own class on campus, it's trickier because I usually have a small handful of Black students in the room. And I'm simultaneously, the demographics of my class are all messed up.
Sure.
I've cross-listed with Afro-American Studies. I changed the title. I've done all kinds of things to kind of address that. And still, I have a very small handful of Black students in there. And so I'm simultaneously trying to fly under the radar and be a good role model for white students while at the same time signaling to the black students, trust me. Like, here's a reason to trust me, right?
Right.
And in the old days, I would get tested by black students.
Oh, sure.
Remember the first time I taught this class in actually back in when we had very large enrollments in it in 3650 humanities, where you've taught many times, I know. I had 200 odd students in this room, 2 black students in the class on the Civil War era.
Wow.
And one of them, first lecture, soon as I open the floor for questions, his hand goes up and he says, "What about the 50 million victims of the slave trade?"
Wow.
And he it was a honest question and a direct question, but he was all but standing, and he was holding what I took to be a Bible, and he was making direct eye contact, and so I gave him my answer about the slave trade. And when the class was over, he came up on stage to talk to me about my answer, because it's not what he'd expected. He'd expected to be pushed aside, or to be minimized, or he'd not expected he'd expected to be in an oppositional relationship with it because who I was. And we were not in an oppositional relationship about it. He stuck with the class. He was a great student in the class. He talked to me after almost every lecture.
Right.
And I get versions of that periodically, where black students want to know what this is going to be.
Oh, absolutely.
If I'm going to be 1 or 2 black people in a room full of white people doing this history, they have to trust me to manage it. And I will confess, I've screwed up. I have screwed up, and I've been called on it by students, and then had to figure out how to address that in front of the group. And that's been interesting.
And that's part of leadership.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great modeling.
No, and that has happened to me as well. All of those experiences have happened to me. I had a student last semester who called me out in class first day. What are my favorite hip hop albums? And I survived when I said "Paid in Full" by Eric B. and Rakim, partly because that's the correct answer.
It's the correct answer.
But ding, 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 ding.
Yeah,
Right.
but when you're in that setting, I mean, the students want the class to be for them, but who they are is different.
Yeah.
If they're black, or if they're white, if they're from a rural area, if it's an area of their interest, as opposed to if they're taking it as sort of ancillary to everything else that they're studying. It's an enormous challenge for us teaching these kind of large classes with a diverse group of people in the room, to try to address everyone and make them feel welcome and make them feel like they can get something out of it at the same time.
That's
and
a tall order.
it's imperfect. There's no way to get it right for
That's
everybody.
I can remember always being outnumbered in courses
Yep.
in the department. But I can remember white students arguing with black students about their experiences because white students had read The Bluest Eye, or they read Color Purple, and said, no, that's not true. Black people don't do that. Black people don't feel this. I've got a friend named John back in Detroit, and he said, so I can remember having to teach folks who are white, who read a couple of books and feel like they're, African Americanist, and they're arguing with black people about their experiences. Some of those lectures got really heated. Well, no, not the lectures. Some of those discussions inside got really heated. I was just
going to say really briefly, I just do want to say this is a general rule. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. I do think, generally speaking, the students are more adept at having those conversations now than they were a decade ago.
That's true.
I'm talking almost 30 years ago. You're right.
UW-Madison has a long way to go in the diversity department, but the experience is a lot of the students, even if they're white, is that they're coming from a more diverse place than they did before. That in general, they're growing up around kids who are not the same as them, even in rural parts of Wisconsin, even if they're coming from faraway places.
And media's changed. People have more exposure to
That's
things.
Right. And
than
so
they did in those days.
I don't want to overstate that, but
Right.
I do think I find that the conversations generally are, even if they're tense or if there are differences, they don't tend to be crude in the way that they were before, and built out of the same kind of ignorance with language to the same degree that it was in the past.
One thing I'll say too that I've noticed just in the last couple of years is as the percentage of international students increases on campus, the percentage of students who have no direct experience of the complexities of American race relations before they get to UW is bigger and bigger. And I think some of them are just baffled.
Yes.
But some of them show up in my office desperate to understand what is going on because they're in deep water.
Yeah.
Right. I remember my days of an academic advisor on campus, interacting with students who are either from rural Wisconsin or international students who've never interacted with or have seen a person of color. Alexander, I just want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
You focus and teach about Black music, but and not just from an entertainment perspective, but really as a part of the civil rights movement, social consciousness. Can you just tell me about that? Just why you find that to be important part of history and how it's taught?
Well, I mean, the short version of a long story is that African Americans have been using music as a means of not just cultural expression, but explicitly political expression from the very beginning. That, if you were denied access to political power through conventional routes, if you were denied access to control of newspapers or to be able to write an article or be on the radio, or voting, right, at a fundamental level, or having the rights of citizenship, you had to find other ways to convey what you experienced, and music has always been one of those ways in which African Americans have conveyed their hopes and their fears and their desires and their sense of identity in terms of being African American and being American. And the music is a really fantastic way to connect to students and to really have this conversation, because in a certain way, it helps you evade that problem Steve was talking about in terms of where you start and where you end, because the music's always going to have the pain of the blues and the hope of gospel and the possibilities of jazz inherent in it. And that tension is just part of what it is. So it really helps me to explain the basic idea that history and progress is not linear, that things can get better, things can be worse at the same time, right? And those things, which things are worse and which things are better changes. But you shouldn't assume everything's just better or everything's just worse. And the music, because musicians are not politicians and they're not polemicists for the most part. They can deal in paradoxes. They can deal in subtlety. They can deal in contradiction, and the contradiction of life. Right. And I think that then helps to explain the complexity of the situation so that maybe people can hear it and see it in a better way.
I like that you bring that to our history class, to the Justified Anger history class. That you bring that element of music, because that on average, our folks who are participating are about 55 and older, at least half of them, and they can relate to the music in the era, but didn't know that what they were listening to had those kinds of messages. So I'm glad. So keep bringing that. So when you're up, I think my engineer's just letting me know that he's reminding me I gotta get to my last question, but again, this is kind of tricky when you're doing this to folks who teach in the African American history department. But I've been using this James Baldwin quote. I use it on Sunday. A letter from a region in my mind from '62, and he said, "Whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves." And so, I guess what I want to just close out with is, many of our listeners are white. How important is it for them to really delve into the topics and the history that we're talking about in order to better understand themselves in America?
Well, to paraphrase Baldwin from a slightly different part of Baldwin,
sure.
The problem is that they think they're white, right?
Yes.
And that they're raised up to believe that there's a thing called white.
Right.
And I don't mean that they don't exist, and I don't mean that their heritages don't exist. I just mean that the things about their pasts and about their lives that really matter to them, unless they are explicit self-conscious white supremacists, in a movement,
right?
Unless they're that, whiteness is not the operative category in their lives.
Right.
It's where their grandparents were from, or their great-grandparents were from, or where their parents or they themselves are from.
Sure.
It's the complexity of their actual backgrounds, not something called whiteness. Whiteness only exists to draw a distinction between whiteness and blackness and whiteness and other forms of non-whiteness. It's a category designed to do that political work. And until they can understand that, they're going to continue to think that the racial formation, the idea of the thing called whiteness, is somehow analogous to the thing called blackness, which it's not in any way, historically or experientially.
Economically, politically.
Yeah.
That's powerful. I'm actually going to be preaching about the development of white identity and its impact on Christianity and a white Jesus. And I'm going to have my bodyguards.
Talk about
after
things.
the church. I'm going to jump right in my car and go home afterwards. But that's people just go blank. You can see it in their eyes when when we talk about what you just mentioned. That's so I love that element of the paraphrasing Baldwin's quote, that it would behoove folks who are not black, but particularly folks who consider themselves white, Caucasian, of European descent, to lean in to understand the plight of black people, because it gives them a better insight of themselves. Your take on that quote, or a comparable lyric from Spinners or someone that's like the same thing?
Well, I was just going to add, because what Steve said was great, is that we often, it's almost a truism in our society, or at least a kind of commonsensical thing, that there is something liberating about doing things for other people, giving to other people, thinking about something bigger than yourself, right? Whether it's a simple act of giving someone a gift or doing someone a favor, whether it is trying to understand something about the world that is not that you're not directly invested in, and to commit to it in some way. And this is not to say that learning about this material is an act of charity. I don't mean it that way. But what I do mean is that when you commit to something bigger than yourself, it is liberating. It's liberating in the sense that it gives you a sense of community. It gives you a sense of hope. It gives you a sense that you can engage the world outside of your own little silo, and that the little world that you are in is not so lonely. And I think when we think about our politics, and we think about our society and the centrality of race historically, the ability to think hard about these questions, to commit to them, and to make them part of your daily life can be liberating if you are white. It's a means to understand both the challenges that are ahead for everyone, but also the opportunities that are there if you're willing to commit and understand those things.
Thank you. That's well
great.
said. Hey, unfortunately, I'm at the end of my time, but I've been having a really wonderful, intriguing conversation with two of my colleagues, Professor Stephen Kantrowitz of UW-Madison, historian, writer. I consider him an activist as well. And my colleague, Alexander Shasko, who's a lecturer in the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as well. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. I appreciate what you do in the classroom. I look forward to your lectures that are coming up real soon. We've got a great group of folks, a great cohort who will be waiting anxiously for your information. And because people look to us at Black Like Me podcast for resources, I want to get I'll get a link from you all, or a couple of titles that you would recommend. We have a note section of our podcast, so we'll just put a couple of links down so that people can, after listening, can say, well, what can I begin reading? Or maybe even ask you a few things that they can read to their children. So we'll put some of those things down as well. This has been another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. And like I told you, we keep bringing you these exciting and intriguing episodes. And so thank you for listening. Make sure that you subscribe and tell your friends. Thank you for being a part of this podcast family. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.